Okay. Hi, BZ. Okay.
Right.
Hi,
So,
Al. Hi,
so
everybody.
doing great. Actually, fabulous. So even though we have only ACEs here right now, I want to talk about this is going to be part of the Amplio Living Ecosystem series. So just be aware of that. And I'm going to talk to those
Okay.
people as well as yourself. And the shift in the ecosystem has been instead of trying to create a foundation of principles and values as was done in the Agile Manifesto, because as we said before, we think that's kind of weak. And the PMI started doing something on that and they seem to have given up. But actually, values and principles is when they weren't first principles is a weak approach in any event. But what's happened in the Amplio Consultant Educators Learning Journey program is that we have come to the conclusion that most people really just want their problem solved and they don't want to be given theory, even if it's accurate. They want to actually know how to solve their problems, be given concrete examples, and then from that, you can teach the theory. So, this idea of turning two things around one, come from solving problems, and number two is don't tell theory to solve the problems, give examples of solving the problems, and then you could reflect on the theory that's there. Amplo has shifted its complete way of education and I guess organization at some level as well to match that. Amplio itself hasn't really changed at all because Amplio, it's not a toolkit, it's not a framework, it's a coherent set of what we call actionable increments, which are small learning modules, anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour, that can be used immediately. So, what happened yesterday, actually, we were doing a one of the A sessions on the value-driven objectives. This is our approach to I don't know, I hate to almost say getting requirements because it's not just about that, but how we decide what to get done. And we had a big insight about how to, I would say, not just explain, but to make explicit the patterns that were present in work I'd done in the 90s because I never had the problem people have always talked about having difficulties about rework and requirements and not knowing what to do. And yet I'm not saying I do waterfall. I don't know how to do that either. But I have, starting in the 80s, started learning how to build things incrementally. I didn't have it explicitly stated this. I call this pre-cognitive agile. I didn't know that's what it was. I was just doing cyclical development, ironically, because I thought I didn't have the discipline to figure it all out, not because I had this deep insight. And what we did in yesterday's session was gave me a realization of how we could explicitly state this. So this session is going to follow the Amplio Living Ecosystem model, presenting problems first. I will give a little bit of presentation of some things, and then I'm going to go through basically uncover patterns in how to actually avoid a lot of the rework I see that people complain about in getting requirements done. So well, let's just list some of the problems to solve. And I'm going to ask you if you have others, but these are ones I've seen a lot. Rework required due to changing requirements. In other words, you build something in one sprint or iteration, and then the next one you realize something new and you got to go back and fix something. Or maybe not rework, maybe it's just wasted. You built something, realize you don't need it, and it's just it stays in there. It's still wasted effort. Um, and this is the heart of value-driven objectives. We want to come from objectives. Yes, Susan.
Do you think you're sharing your screen?
I did because I was, and then I stopped because, thank you, because I had to get out to check things. So let's see. Let me share my screen. Yeah. Anytime I start out, Susan, because you're always the one who points it out to me, when I'm not sharing my screen, you don't see a background, then no, I think I am, but I'm not. Thank you. So let me just go back to show the slides I had shown. Well, this is the border slide. Okay, so yeah, right here. So problems to solve. So this is part of the heart of value-driven objectives. And the value-driven we're going to see is value both in terms of the customer and value to the developers or whoever's involved in this. And the other issue I've seen a lot is discovering ignored stakeholders late. Like after you're almost done, you remember, oh my goodness, what about these people? And part of that comes from that most of Agile is about users and customers. In fact, you even hear that customer is who's paying for it. In fact, that's not true. A lot of software, I built a lot of software the customers never paid for. They were additions and enhancements to things that they had paid for previously, maybe, but they hadn't paid for this. This was just an upgrade to make it more attractive. Okay, we sometimes solve the wrong problem. We sometimes have confusing workflow. Now, what you're seeing here is, I'm not going to go through all this. This is just to give you the background. The value-driven objectives approach incorporates a lot of pieces from a lot of things. And I know, and I'm only going to worry about the value-driven objectives part of how you can improve your process today, because it'll give us a lot of insights on these principles and things. But what's interesting, and then there's ways to enhance the efficiency of your value streams and all that. When you first see this, and this is a side point, when you first see this, some people might say, oh my God, this thing is now not just value driven objectives, but design thinking and jobs to be done and human and all that. When it isn't, it takes some insights from design thinking, takes some insights from jobs to be done, takes some insights from human centered development, puts them all together. Now, here's the other thing. People don't like to talk about this because it's their business, but the way education is done today, especially around certification, which almost requires a focus on the certification information and requires half-day and full-day training. If you have studied curriculum, and I have for over 40 years, I got into curriculum building in the 80s. The way most workshops are taught is actually virtually the antithesis of how you should be designing them. So even though what I'm talking about isn't huge, it can be covered in a day. This is being done 8 hours, 1 hour sessions or hour and a half maybe. But part of the problem we have in the Agile space is we don't get awareness of a lot of things because of the way it's taught. Okay, I just want to give this as a background. Okay, so we're going to attend to this. This is the starting point. And we want to come from objectives because they change slower than implementations. And we need to identify all stakeholders. This was the slide we used. I'm not going into all that. I'm doing something else. As is this. This may go a little bit deeper than I want. I'll get into the meat in about 5 minutes, but I want to give this background. So we need to understand the objective to be accomplished, and this has to be based on stakeholders, their values, success criteria, and constraints. This is the essence, the heart, the kernel, the starting point of Tom Gilb's Evo system, by the way. Okay. Too much focus on solutions requires rework. Why? Because there are multiple solutions. Because what problem you're trying to solve may literally change. So what we want, I'm contending, we have enough certainty to build the next step with little chance of having to rework things. Now, you may disagree, and that's fine. And as we get into it, I'll show you some things that we should have a discussion. But this is not an opinion. I did this on about 20 different vertical applications in the 80s and 90s. I almost did no rework in the process of it. We had a case study in a session we talked about. I'm not going to go over that one, but I will some others. But we have to be in control. In other words, and this is the big insight for today, you don't just interact with people and get their opinions about things, what they want and what they need. You need to take a certain approach to how you reduce the uncertainty in what needs to happen, okay? And we could use our objectives to guide our development to uncover what we need to do. By the way, this is everything I'm talking about is not described in How Big Things Get Done by Ben Fleiberg. Sure I'm getting his last name right, but it's very consistent with it. And in particular, the Balboa Guggenheim Museum, they didn't know how they were going to implement a lot of the stuff there, but they knew what they wanted that thing to be. And the architect came up with this amazing building design. And then they figured out the details, and there was very little rework because they had solid objectives and they had a clear path to get there. Okay. We have obstacles to creating value. This is true. So believe me, I'm not going to tell you, oh, people were doing waterfall wrong. I'm not going to say that. This is not a waterfall approach. Okay, it's something else. So I just want to be clear when I say we can do these things, I don't mean do better there. Okay. Now, this is the interesting insight. We have obstacles, we have uncertainty, we have people don't know, we have different teams working together. I'm saying, yes, I know this. These obstacles is can guide us, and that's what we're going to talk about. The point is not to get the requirements up front, but is to get requirements when you are ready to understand them, because then you don't redo things, and we'll see this. So this is a question. How do you design your workflows to avoid the potential of rework? Okay, so I'm going to pause for a second, talking a bit too much for the way we normally do this session, but does this make sense, what I'm contending? Not saying you agree with it. Okay, any questions about what I've said? Not questions. If you, well, I disagree, but I understand what you're saying. That's fine. Okay, so what's in our way? I would say we don't have clarity on the objectives. We know the objectives, but we don't know all the details. There's a case study I'm going into here, which was we were building a like a lean construction materials thing where we wanted to let's see, just notice the read AI is, oh yeah, it's there, good. So we knew we were building it, so how to basically deliver the construction materials at a site. They knew some of the things they needed, but they didn't understand all of it. So what do we do there? And then there was a case I'll talk about where we had a UX where the people who I had to satisfy in the UX, they had no idea what they wanted the UX to be. So that was a risk of, well, I'll build it, I'll show them, they'll say they don't like it. This is an interesting one I almost never hear about, but I was once on a project where I was the main developer. We had actually 3 groups of developers. I was the main developer on one thing. I was creating the interface or the go-between mid-tier level for something, not Ameritrade, it wasn't with them, but it was something like that. This was back in 99 when online trading wasn't that. What hadn't happened, and this company wanted us to write them one. And then there was these mainframe folks in the company, our client, who were known to be slow in their development. So the concern was by the time I could get them their requirements, they would not be able to do it in time. It was like they had a 6-month turnaround. We had a 9-month schedule. So I had to see how to do that. And then customers know what they want, but they change their mind on demonstration, or they say they know what they want. So like prototyping didn't work and there's wasted effort. So how do we deal with these ideas? Well, let's get advice from the earliest agilist on record. You might wonder who that is. I'm going to say he's Marcus Aurelius. Yeah, I was trying to get a laugh out of you, Susan. Mission accomplished. Okay, so why do I say that? So there's this great book I read. I don't have a reference here, but this is a quote of Marcus. So, oops, I got the animation wrong. So this comes from, well, this is Marcus Aurelius's writings, but I read this first in Ryan Holiday's The Obstacle is the Way, which I think is a phenomenal book. But he says, this is what Marcus says: our actions may be impeded, but there can be no impeding our intentions or dispositions, because we can accommodate and adapt. The mind adapts and converts to its own purposes the obstacle to our acting. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Now, what he's saying is that the obstacles provide us insight on how to achieve our goals. Okay, and we're not saying I'm not saying obstacles are opportunities. Obstacles kind of are opportunities if you step back, look at them, and take advantage of them. We're saying they give us the insights in how to achieve our objectives. Okay, this is what he means. So I'm not being Pollyanna here. I think obstacles can give us insights and they can be some opportunity, but I'm saying something different. Aurelius was saying, if we look at the obstacles and instead of saying, oh, expletive deleted, we say, wow, this is what I have to solve. This gives me the insights on what to do. You can get motivated to solve them. And they give you insights. That's what he's saying. Now, my question is, I gave you 4 problems. Is there a pattern to the problems? Like, have clarity on the objectives, but not the details. Where do we start? Because there's a risk of building something incorrectly. Well, building what we are clear of has little risk of changing. See, that's what happened. I was involved with this client, and they were again trying to build they wanted to lay the construction materials that they were selling to a client at a construction site. How do we lay them out so they don't have a lot of extra movement at the site? It's kind of lean construction idea. Again, back in this is about 2000, 2001, I think. It was kind of new in those days, but I knew lean because I didn't know that's what it was called, but I'd studied Toyota in the 80s. So I had a good idea about eliminating certain delays and stuff. This might have been a little later, but I think it was pre-Poppendick. It might have been 2005. So the idea is, what would you build first? And the reason, the insight I had was what we were most certain on was the foundation of the system anyway. In other words, we needed to have the materials, we needed to have a way to move them, we needed to have a way of locating them. How we would order them and detail them, well, we didn't know that, but we needed to know the stuff we needed to know to do the questionable stuff. That stuff we had certainty on. Okay, I want to say this again because this is important insight, because this is not a one-off. There are times you don't have certainty on certain requirements, but if they depend on something you have certainty on, then build that first, because that will give you certainty on the things you didn't have certainty on. Does that make sense? That's the insight we're talking about here. And I remember they asked me this, and I looked at it and said, I have no idea about this detail, but I know we got to do this. We have to do this eventually, and there's no risk doing this. So let's just do it first because there's no risk. So this is a risk mitigation idea. No idea of the UX. I was building the interface for a search engine that streamed data. This was not Google or Yahoo, anybody like that. This company no longer exists. They got bought out. And the risk was reworking the UX. I could not get clarity on the people who were responsible for what the UX looked like. But I knew the navigation path, sort of. They wanted a way to go through a hierarchy. They wanted a way to do a search. They wanted a way to search by tags and things like that. So I knew what they wanted, but I had very little certainty on any pieces of it per se. So what I realized was, well, when you have what you could think of Google, well, not Google. Google's not a good example because of the way they do their search. But Yahoo used to have a way of, and now Yahoo was big at this time, even though this wasn't them. Yahoo had a way, oh, I'm interested in this, like Wikipedia. You could go through Wikipedia. That's actually not a bad example. You could start somewhere and say, I'm interested in this topic, and then this subtopic, and then this subtopic. That would be a taxonomic search, or I could search. So what I did is I realized, well, some part of the UX I know, and build that. In other words, we talk about iterative development. This is the other big insight here. We talk about iterative development like we, as the value add people, need to get clarity. But the reality is they need to get clarity. I mean, if they knew what they wanted, they could just tell us. Even that wouldn't be good enough, because what they say they want is very often not what would do them the best good. That's why a little bit of design thinking is built into this. And they're not used to thinking in terms of process and workflow. That's why jobs to be done insights are in this, which I'm not going to go into. I'm just saying why those aspects are there. So this third case was, I knew what to do. I mean, this was one of those, it was a new product, yes, but we had existing systems. My client didn't have a system that would do this, but there were other people who had systems that would do this. So what do? You just look, see what the other system does. You make your requirements. We had great clarity on all the requirements. Theoretically, we could have done this in a waterfall method. I say theoretically because there were other concerns. There were two other concerns, actually. One concern was that even though I was the mid-tier, that meant that I was going back to a database, and those people had a reputation of being very, very slow. So if I built the thing based on what I was building, by the time I got to them, they wouldn't have time to build the rest. So number one, I had to get them information right away. Number two was I remember using TCP/IP, and in those days I could spell it, but I probably have this really fat book I bought. I probably gave it away actually, but I bought these really two fat books on TCP/IP. I told the people who'd hired me I didn't know TCP/IP, but that I could learn quickly, and that they hired me because of my demonstration of design patterns. I don't know if I'd written my book yet, but I was well known having done a lot of seminars in design patterns. So they hired me. So we had these two unknowns. So one of them is technical, which is how I manage the risk. I'm not doing that. I actually have another seminar on that. But focus on what the team requiring log lead times needed first. So you can start seeing already that there is a pattern. I'm actually changing what I'm looking at and changing how I'm working. Okay. And then customers say they know what they want, but change their mind on demonstration. Actually, this was this huge insight for me in the mid-90s. I had a customer, they were like our trophy customer. How else can I say it? Uh, they were a big salon spa. They were the originators of the day spa concept. And everybody looked at them as this is the ideal. These guys know what they're doing. And they were a client of ours. I was writing software for salons and spas back then. So I was always wanting to make them happy. And I had a history with them, or they had history with me, however you want to look at it, that whenever they asked for a report, I would write it and then they would tell me that's not what they meant. This was in the mid-90s, so I didn't know Agile explicitly. So I said, I am over this. Even though I was getting paid for all this rework, I didn't want to just get paid for doing rework. I wanted to get paid for adding value. So I said, I'm over this. And what I decided to do was go into their data and build up and manually create. I dumped it into an Excel spreadsheet, manually created it, reformatted it to look like a report. And I gave them an exact picture of what they were asking me to do. I mean, an exact picture. You couldn't tell if it came from the program or I did it manually. And I showed it to them and they said, this is great, Al. It's just what we want. I was so proud of myself. So I then go and I write the report and I show it to them and they say, that's not what we want, Al. I shut off the part of my brain that comes up with these curse words. I shut that off, fortunately, didn't say anything. But I went back and I said, what just happened? Because these were smart people. I mean, this was a top end primo business. I knew the people personally there. In fact, I was friends with a few of them by this point. And what I realized happened is until she went through and actually did the selection to generate the report, she wasn't putting the dots together of the data. So it was like, I can't even prototype in a case where I know exactly what the thing would look like. Have you had any problems like this? Is this just I had these problems and they're not like this, or are these kind of common problems?
Yeah, um, we had a similar problem on the military healthcare program I worked on, and
You mean number three?
yeah,
Actually, I could see I've worked in the military. Number one I had a lot of that. Didn't have anything on the UX with the military.
you know.
Okay.
Yeah. So the problem we had was that the the data modeler folks, the data analysts thought they really understood the data, but when the folks in the offices at the healthcare shop really got in there and started looking at what had been done and said, well, this is all wrong. And one of the things that I found that was a problem was the team had not really looked at what they were currently using and how it was really currently being used. And they didn't use that as a basis for doing data profiling. So they really kind of got off on the wrong track.
Yeah, what you're saying just brings up another issue. I'm just going to type it in here to remind me. It can also be different understandings between different groups is what you're bringing up. So it may not just be a time frame that's the issue. It's really great because I have come across this as well, but I don't know why it didn't occur to me to talk about this one. But the idea here is here you must give them bigger lead times, but it can also be their different understandings, and you need quick feedback to get clarity on what the understandings are. Okay. So it seems to me this is a pattern here. If we build incrementally, this should not be a surprise, right? Isn't this the essence of Agile? So we build incrementally along the lines of our biggest risks. Our biggest risks is maybe the different thing. But that just makes sense. In fact, I could maybe have this as a two-line. The build incrementally along the lines, build incrementally is Agile, but along the lines of our biggest risk is the insight I'm presenting. It's not just building incrementally. There's a path to build incrementally. In fact, this may be why when people complain a lot of Agilists are really just doing waterfall in small iterations is because when you build incrementally, but not along the lines of the bigger risk, you're not getting feedback. You're just building this piece or doing this design. So this actually is sounds like a slight improvement, but it's actually fairly dramatic because you don't get mitigation of the risk until you close the cycle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's fine to build things incrementally, but it's got to be part of an iteration that makes sense to the people you're doing the development for.
Yeah, let me
And
restate.
carve things up and show them things, and
Yeah.
have them look at things as you work on it. And it might be something that you do every couple of days. You don't have to wait 2 weeks to do something like that.
Yeah, I think 2 weeks is seriously long. But let me, as you just said, let me say what you just said in another way. Not what you just said in another way, kind of just a bullet point. It's important to build incrementally, but how you build it incrementally is important. And when you see the way people complain and are just kind of going through the motions, they've left that last one out. We were just supposed to build in this sprint or whatever. And the answer is no. And here's the thing. We're going a little deeper, but having just said that, so let me just say these two things. We're going to build in increments, or we're going to build in increments that enable us to deal with our biggest risk. That second one is more involved, but it's not that much more involved. See, going for the simplest statement can leave out the most important aspect of it. And that's why I've always felt we don't try to design something as simply as possible. We try to design something so it can be simply used effectively. And that's a big distinction. Anyway, coming back here. So this kind of surprised me for anybody who was in the ACE program yesterday. I hadn't talked about patterns, but as I was getting ready for this, I made my decision to switch. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. I should have said this at the beginning of the session. Apologies. I had planned to do this today's session on premortem and quickest valuable releases and use those to do principles. And I do have videos on those. So I will make those available to you since I said I was going to cover it today. But this way of describing, because we're actually in the process of doing the value-driven objectives workshop inside the ACE program. We had a session yesterday and last week. I just felt this was really a breakthrough, not so much in a new way of doing things. I did this in the 80s and 90s, but a way of explaining it so it's explicit and we can come from problems, explain it, and then do the principles underneath it. So that's why I switched. But I forgot, Kurt and Dale, you may not have known that. So apologies for the switch, but I'm doing kind of the same thing intended in the ecosystem approach. And I think I'm very excited about this because I think this is laying the groundwork for a much better way of getting an understanding of customer needs. Now you might notice I'm trying to avoid saying of getting requirements because getting requirements is not the issue. It's understanding what the customer needs is the issue. What they really can use is the issue. Requirements are one little piece of that. Okay. So what is a pattern a la Alexander? Okay. Chris Alexander is the one who really came up with this first. And a lot of people have been exposed to like the scrum plot patterns and things like that. And I contend they are not consistent with Alexandrian patterns. So I'm not going to go any more than that, but there are differences. And I just want to explain this here, but I think they've muddied the water of what really is. So from a pattern language, now he wrote 3 books on patterns. He's written, I mean, Alexander's work is totally amazing. And he wrote 3 books, A Pattern Language, The Timeless Way of Building, and I don't have the third one here because it's not germane to this conversation, called The Oregon Experiment. And everybody talks about a pattern language, and it's really cool. And I have it up here first because I'm going to take some quotes from it, and where he talks about how patterns can be used in a cohesive, coherent manner. But I personally like The Timeless Way of Building better. Now, this is why you might like one versus the other. In The Timeless Way of Building, he talks about the foundation of his whole philosophy of patterns. And in a pattern language, he actually presents a language to use these to build towns and uh, houses and buildings, things like that. But I really recommend this. This is like a Bible to me in terms of how to do design. My technical books are based on this book. Okay, I've written a book, Design Patterns Explained, with Jim Trott, and that's was explaining design patterns by the Gang of Four. It's still one of the only books of its type that actually explains why they work, not just what they are. Anyway, so in Alexander's, what he says is each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in our environment, then describes the core of the solution to that problem in such a way that you can use the solution a million times over without ever doing it the same way twice. Now, Alexander never said the next line, but it's been paraphrased into patterns are solutions to recurring problems in a context. Never said this. It is an aspect of patterns, but see, this is part of the problem with taking something and making it simpler, quote unquote, simpler to read, but not simpler to understand. Patterns are not the solutions. See, patterns have solutions to recurring problems. Being a solution and having a solution are 2 different things. So when I taught patterns, one of the biggest problems I had to overcome was to get people to stop looking at the solution and look at the thought process behind the pattern that got you the solution. People would rather just be given the solution. Most do. Most want that. Now, some of you here, maybe everybody here, has probably a little different mindset. The fact that you're here shows that you have some interest in learning how to solve things and think, but I'm sure you come across people who would rather just be told what to do. So there's this bifurcation in how we teach the Amplio approach, which is, yes, those people who are coaching others need to know more, but you want to teach the others in a way they want to be taught, which is solve my problem. Okay. Okay. So let's define a pattern. This is kind of not exactly Alexander's, but it's consistent with it. Remember, they provide a solution to a problem by attending to the context the problem is showing up and the issues involved. Alexander calls these forces. Now, this is where it gets a little dicey because the Agile community is kind of split into 2 camps. There are those people who kind of follow, well, we're complex adaptive system, which we are. But complexity means we really don't know what's going on. We have complex domains, we have simple domains or clear domains, and we have chaotic domains, the Cynefin model. That's one group, which I'm not in, and I think is detrimental to think that way. Scrum is kind of in that way because it's kind of a black box approach, saying, well, we inspect and adapt, but we don't really know what's going on under the covers because it's all complex. Now, there's another camp, which is from Eliyahu Goldratt, The Theory of Constraints. Now, I'm not talking about constraints and all that. Actually, in a lot of ways, Goldratt's work has gone a full arc. I love TOC. I use TOC, but to me, it's just TOC itself. The constraint idea is just one of 4 models I use. I'm not going to go there today. But Goldratt had a lot of good stuff. The Goal was one of his books. But in a sense, he's gone to a different place. And his daughter wrote a book, Goldratt's Rules of Flow, where she talks about the constraint, but it's actually a bigger picture model of things. And one of the things Goldratt says, he calls it inherent simplicity. I don't have a slide on it. I should probably have injected that here. Inherent simplicity, he said, Goldratt comes from the fact that underneath all this, whatever we're seeing, there are relatively few causes and effects governing the whole system. He akins this to Newton's belief that the universe, and Newton did say this, Isaac Newton did say this, that the world is in the mechanics, nature is in harmony with itself and is surprisingly simple. Now, of course, this was before quantum mechanics and, relativity and all that, so he didn't know about Heisenberg. But let me tell you, I do not know what's going on at the atomic level of this pen, but if I let go, I'm certain it's going to fall. At our level, there's more certainty. But here's the thing. He didn't say you know everything. When you combine Goldratt with Ackoff's work of systems, you shift from looking at the system as a whole, oh, that's complex, to you look at the components and the relationships between the components. So, what does that mean? That there are complex relationships. Well, we don't even see them. They're too complicated. Or they're complicated. We might see them, but we don't understand them, or we do, but it takes a lot of work. Or they may be simple. If I change this, this changes that. There are also nonlinear events. A little change here might make a big change here. Let me explain this. Well, the straw that broke the camel's back is an example of a nonlinear event. Small change, big thing. Chernobyl, most disasters like Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, most crashes, airline crashes, most disasters happen because some little thing happens and that starts a cascading series of events. If you ever watch Seconds from Disaster, they go through that. It's really cool. They show the disaster, but then they back it up and they show all these little things. A really good example of this is the destruction of the Piper Alpha, or the explosion of the Piper Alpha drilling platform in the North Sea. You won't believe what caused the problem. What the little thing caused the problem is they had documentation on one thing and a different aspect of documentation on the same thing in two different platforms, two different parts of the building. What? How could that cause the problem? It's because when one group did one thing, another group didn't know they had done it, and they did something that triggered basically gas into a place it wasn't supposed to be. The safety had been shut off and nobody knew it. And that one sequence led to about 10 other things in sequence that you blew everything up. That's a great example of simple relationships cascading in nonlinearity. And it was not seen because in the whole system, nobody could see the documentation being a problem. Do you know what I'm saying? It was complexity caused the nonlinear problem, but the nonlinearity was the issue. Now, why is that important to us? Because if we're building something, see, once you trigger an event like on the Piper Alpha or Chernobyl, there's nothing you can do about it. But we're building products and we have control over that. We need visibility. It's a different world. And in fact, if you're even building physical products, Joe, he now went to work for Tesla. He was building cars. I can't think of his last name. Use Scrum to build cars. I can remember his first name. But anyway, he actually made interchangeable modules, so you could make these changes. Anyway, so a pattern and I'm not going to create patterns out of all this. I just wanted to show that we can talk about patterns for each of those four things I talked about. You give it a name, what situation did it occur, what challenge is being solved, the system of forces, what are the issues? In our world, building products, the forces would be things like, how much work do I have? How much uncertainty do I have? Am I causing rework? What's the likelihood of a misunderstanding? Yeah, that's a great question, Abis. I was just checking the chat. I will deal with that question after I go through the pieces, because that's actually a really, really good question. It's a really good question. He asked, how does employee deal with sustainability? Okay, so I'm not going to build these patterns. What I wanted to do is just show you how we could take these and create. I will eventually create patterns out of this. This is all insights that happened just yesterday, so I haven't had a lot of chance. But let's just look at this. This is that first case study. You have clarity on the objectives, but not all the detail. Where do we start? I've actually noticed I'm creating the context here, right? I could come up with a name. I don't know what the name would be. Partial clarity. What would the forces be present here? What do I mean by that? It's worth a couple of minutes conversation. So think of a time where you had some clarity, but not some clarity. What are the issues you have to deal with?
Requirement issues down the line.
How do you mean down the line?
Of course, we know we draw from objective to eventually have a requirement clearly defined. So if we have objectives that are not clear, that will definitely lead to a requirement issue, that is working on the wrong thing, things like that.
Yeah. And in fact, then one requirement affects another requirement.
Yeah.
So there's this relationship between the requirements is one of the forces. I actually kind of said that, but see, notice how bringing this up makes it clearer. So that's what's so nice about this. So requirements. So what you have is you could start looking at some of these issues, making it explicit. Susan?
Yeah, one thing when I was working in it was basically a card verification or other verification of payment method, shall we say. There was a disconnect between the people who did the online part of it and the people who did stuff like billing and research into whether somebody had actually gotten an approval on it. So the people would get the online approval and they would think that was done, but you actually had to be able to bill people for it. And you actually, if there was a dispute as to whether something was approved, you had to be able to say, yes, this credit card company said that they approved this charge on this date on this card. And one of the, and because there was this disconnect, there was always a lot of late discovery because the online system was the one that got the visibility, but the other stuff had to be done as well.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that's interesting about patterns, and there are lots of them. Here, I was just doing this again. See, this is actually, see what the value of organizing it like this instead of just jumping to the end. We can say, well, are these relevant? This creates awareness to us. To me, the first level of competency is not competency, it's merely aware that it's there. It's like shifting what I don't know to what I know I don't know. And now I can learn more about that. Okay.
So you're basically taking this problem domain that you're working in and you're breaking it down into pieces that can be discussed and understood. Right?
That's correct. But I'm doing it in a particular way.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right, Dale. You're right on. But the particular way is this. I'm doing it in a way that actually can inform how I want to do my workflow. So it's not just a decomposition. It's a decomposition in a way that elicits the next step to take. And that's important because we can otherwise, how far do you decompose? What do you decompose? See, when you decompose too much, you're wasting your time because that decomposition will turn out to not have been necessary as you learn more. I mean, it'll be a different decomposition. Okay. So I want to kind of wrap up this interaction in about 10 minutes, which I can do, and then we have time to talk about more things because some things coming up that's interesting. But notice I can do the same thing. We have no idea of the UX. So the context is we're building a system with the UX and we have no idea how to make the UX. We know under the covers. We don't know how we want to interact with people. Oh, by the way, interacting with people. Do you notice how this sounds a little bit like human-centered design? That's in fact, that could be another interesting thing to put in here. Which aspect of jobs of value-driven objectives can be used? Well, understanding how people look at things. So the system of forces here is we have a well-known database of the stuff we've searched. Now, there were a lot of technical issues here, but I'm not talking about the technical issues. Remember, I did this. I was hired in this case, again, because they knew I knew patterns and they needed somebody to build this. And there were a lot of things about performance issues too. I mean, this was back in 2000, 2001, 2002. They had decent PCs then, but they're not like they are now. And my solution was basically, we knew some things. Again, we knew some things, we didn't know some things. And one of the problems that I had seen was that non-computer people, when they look at a computer prototype, they think you're almost done. I mean, most everybody I know has had the experience of you show a prototype, you tell them it's a prototype, you explain this is a flat screen, this is not working software, and you show it to them, and then they say, oh, that's great, you're almost done, right? And I was like dealing with a lot of these people. I probably shouldn't say dealing, there's a little judgment there. These were smart people, but I was kind of dealing as a developer with these folks. I didn't understand a lot of this stuff. So what I decided to do was one of the risks. In fact, see, it's interesting as I go through here. I'm going to have to go through this recording and fill this all in. That was my intention. I thought this would be useful to do it this way. The people deciding on the UX what UX would confuse prototypes with working software. So what I did here was I knew that was going to happen, but here's something I have never seen anybody confused with working software is if I had something written on a piece of paper and I showed them the piece of paper, handwritten on the paper. I never had that happen. They know that's not a computer program. So what I decided to do was when I had something I had no idea of, just ideas, but nothing built, I would literally hand draw it and I would put that on the right. So like as it came to actually displaying the answer, it would be that way. And on the left, I had some stuff working. So those would be screenshots. And they would be screenshots where I would include, we were working on Microsoft systems, PCs. I would include you know how PCs have the little square and X and all that. I'd include that. You could tell this was an exact screenshot. So on the left, you had a screenshot, clearly computer working, and on the right, you'd had the hand. And then I would put things like, well, I had the screenshot, but not on the computer. I had HTML, I had a Word document, you know, I had a sketch. So you could see left to right. What I would do is show them a navigation of basically the job to be done as they navigated this, a little bit of jobs to be done, the workflow, customer workflow in this. And on the left, as I would get stuff done, I would move it from like in the middle, maybe I started with hand-drawn and then it turned into a Word document, then it turned into HTML, then it turned into a screenshot. You could actually see the workflow as we project. And you could see how far I'd gotten into actually implementing it or getting the design down in place. In fact, I remember I had, like, if this was my desk and there was a wall there was a door to my right, and I had all this on the wall in front of me. And it was kind of funny. At least once a day, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, different people from the company, we weren't that big, about, I don't know, 30 people. It was a startup, maybe 15 or 20, I think, but more like 20. Somebody would walk in the door. It was always open. Somebody would walk in the door. They would stand behind me. They'd look at the wall. You know, they might grunt hi or something, and then they would leave. They didn't want to bother me, but they wanted to see, hey, how's Al doing? And you could tell by looking up. So that was interesting too. Okay. And that worked. Why? Because I never implemented anything unless they had decided what was really rare, what they really wanted. And believe me, these were tough customers. I joke that, well, it's true. It seemed that every time I walked in, they each had a different opinion. And then when I left, they didn't discard their opinion. They just added another possibility. And it was when I first noticed that I realized I can't build what they're saying because they're going to change what they're saying, what they want, after I show it to them. Drawing on a piece of paper is a lot faster than writing a computer program and debugging it. Okay.
It's also faster than actually using the UX design or prototyping tool as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the references you're giving. I'll check those out later. I've heard of Alan Cooper. I don't think I ever met him, but I heard always good things about him. So,
we brought him in when I worked for Coca-Cola back in the 90s,
yeah.
along with some other folks who were working on doing object analysis and design. And one of the things people were really struggling with was UX design outside of the green screen world. And so we actually, some of us at Cooper at a conference, and we actually had him come in and do some training for us.
Yeah. Yeah. See, the thing we're already starting to see between building on the foundation and the unknown UX, one of the forces we're doing, and as part of the solution, is how do we avoid rework? How do we avoid building something we don't need? And how do we avoid rework? And I'm not worried about if what I do fits the customer or not, is the customer's value or not. It's value to us. In fact, this idea that it's waste if it's not adding value to the customer is actually wrong. That's what might have made sense, did make sense in the manufacturing. But even then, Taiichi Ohno did not say that. He defined waste as if it doesn't add value to the customer and it doesn't enable you to add value to the customer faster. And people tend to forget that second one. Okay. Anyway, so let's go to the third one, multiple developers. Well, this one was actually really simple. These guys had a 6-month lead time. We had a 9-month project. That means that I had to get them the stuff ASAP. So I worked on that first. I defined the language, how I would interact with them to get the information out. They were slow, but they were consistent and worked out great. And then while I was waiting for them, because we did this iteratively too, I would work with them, and then while I was waiting for them, I'd work on my stuff. And then they would come back to me, and I'd let that, I might not get interrupted that day, but by the next day, I'd start working on it. So what I'm intending to is speed up or reduce delays in what I'm doing, getting feedback, and avoiding rework and avoiding working on things I don't need. This is the pattern that's taking place. Customers can visualize. I built the whole thing. I showed it to them. They said I was wrong. It wasn't that big a deal. This was not a huge report. A few days of work got lost. Now this happened in, I don't know, was this 95? I think it was 94 maybe. Around that, pre-Agile. This was why when Agile came out, not this one, but in general, this was one of the reasons when Agile, it occurred to me when Agile came out, you know what? If when she said what she wanted, I'd keep the objectives in mind and know what the objectives are. It was a stylist report, their staff report. If I had just given them a listing of the staff and the total services they did. And I said, is this the general layout? She said, sure, but I need to know what departments, like is it hair, is it color, et cetera. I said, great, I'll add that. And then they said, well, that's great, but now I need to have totals. Oh, great, I'll add that. And now I need to, now you need to say what percentage of this is based, are they doing, like what percentage of hair color services is this stylist doing? I said, great, I'll do that. See, I knew how to write code where I could change the code. I did not anticipate the change, but what I knew was if I wrote my code in a way that when something changed, I had to change many, many places, that was bad. That was not a good way to do things. I knew that. So I would write my code not anticipating what would change, but just writing it so if something did change, it wasn't hard to limit the number of places I had to change. Later, I would codify this in what I call Shalloway's law and Shalloway's principle. I just did it intuitively. What happened, the way I came up with Shalloway's law was I had written my patterns book. I can remember this was such a funny thing. This guy comes up at a break in the workshop and he says, Al, you've written a successful book. You ought to name something after yourself. So of course, this is my next best friend, right? And I think, yes. So I go home and I think about it and I try to figure out what can I name after myself. And the only thing I could think of is that when n things needed to change and n was greater than one, I'm a mathematician by training, so of course I need a formula in it, then Shalloway will find at most n minus one things. Meaning if there's more than one, I won't find them all. I didn't decide on this. I didn't decide on gravity either. It's just the way I am. So a few months later, somebody said, Al, Shalloway's law is great, but what do I do about it? And I realized, oh, Shalloway's principle avoids situations where Shalloway's law applies. And that's put it in one place. And then I could find it or have a compiler find it for me. Because some compilers that have, well-defined interfaces that will check type checking will do that. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. I'm building it one at a time, a little bit, but I made my code changeable, not by creating a report framework. I actually did that one time. I did that in another system, but I had the ability to change reports quite simply. So the question is, let's reflect for a minute on this. What did we learn? Because remember, we started with problems. I wanted to end with principles. What are the principles underneath all this? What are some of the ones I've mentioned before I put up what I've got? What are some things I've mentioned as principles? Like this is the way it is, like first principles, not just guidance.
Inherent simplicity.
Yeah, so there's this idea that there are a few things, causes and effects. Can you identify some of the causes and effects that inherent simplicity points us to? What did we talk about with delays and feedback and things like that? Or Susan, go back to your example where you had different people with different understandings.
Yes, well,
There's a principle involved in that. What would that have been?
as far as delays go, if you have a long delay between something being written and somebody giving feedback on it, then by the time the feedback about the things that aren't right get back to the person who did it, they have to reconstruct in their mind what it was. They don't get the immediate feedback that would make it faster for them to see what had gone on. And in the meantime, they may have built a whole bunch of stuff on top of that will need to be reworked because they didn't get the feedback about the first part that they wrote.
Right. Is this close enough? Delays and
Yes.
feedbacks correlated to increased work. And it's interesting though,
More concise.
I'm sorry, what?
Much more concise.
But the story's good because that's more understandable. But here's the other thing that you said that made me also get an insight. It's not just rework, like rework in the work I do, but reworking my brain to get back to where I was.
Yes,
Now I
because
could,
even writing a document, if you hear about a problem with it 3 weeks later rather than say the next day, you have to reconstruct it if it's not something you've been working on.
yeah. This points to, I'm sorry, keep going.
Another thing that showed up in the example that I was doing is that basically there were some stakeholders who were ignored until they complained that they didn't like what had come out of it.
Right. Right. And
And
that goes back to the multiple stakeholders. Yeah.
Yeah, and discovery because you didn't bother finding all the stakeholders.
That's right. And you know all the stakeholders up front, or you can know if you look for them, but the problem is you don't look for them because we're talking about users and customers. And as Edgar Schein says, we don't think and talk about what we see what we're able to think and talk about. So if you're using user stories, I just wrote something on why user stories are really archaic and ineffective. They have you look on a small aspect of what you need to use. You're looking at wants and needs. You're also just looking at users and customers. It's not effective, and you see a lot of these same recurring problems taking place. Now, there was one other thing I kind of wanted to say, and I kind of forgot. But anyway, maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't.
One more
Yeah.
thing also in the example that I gave, it's very easy to ignore the stakeholders who won't be affected until after some event happened in the system.
Yeah. And you know what? Sometimes you have to ignore certain stakeholders because you can't necessarily please everybody, but you should know you're ignoring them.
And you should know what their concerns are, even if the business requirements, as it were, override that
Exactly.
particular concern.
So taking you on that, on what conditions are you going to ignore particular stakeholders?
Well, what you have to do, and there is a slide I have in the deck, but I don't have it in that area, so I'm going to find it. What you have to do, first of all, you have to understand what you have to do is you have to understand the values, success criteria, and constraints of the stakeholders involved, right? Who are your stakeholders? What are their success criteria? What are their values? What are their constraints? And then this is something I learned from Joy Inc. I was in the process of finishing the slide. I should have Joy Inc. here. Richard Sheridan, brilliant book, best XP book I've ever read, and it's also about how to create a fun company. And you could think of this here. You could think of these were users, but you could think of this as a stakeholder map, and the real important ones are here, and the not as important ones are out here. And the reason it's so important to talk about stakeholders is they're not always users. Like this is a horrible example. Like I said, it was still I should say sponsors. Okay, for example.
Yeah. I know you talk about sponsoring stakeholders, consuming stakeholders.
Exactly. Yeah. See, these are consuming stakeholders, but who's paying for this? The best example, although it's changing now, but if you go back 10 years, like is Southwest Airlines. There's a reason Southwest Airlines didn't have the reason they had free baggage and the reason they didn't offer food except snacks that the stewardesses could walk up and down the aisle with is because one of their big models was one of their big business models was quick turnarounds on the airplanes. And if you you can see how long it takes to board a plane now with everybody putting their luggage up. Well, they didn't want that because it was easier for them to check them and get them on the plane and off the plane, and then they could get people on board and off the plane faster. And in that process, they'd have more flights. And not having to load food on the plane saved costs, but more important than saving the cost of the food, and they usually had short haul flights, it also enabled the quicker turnaround because you didn't have to get the food there as one less logistic nightmare. So The stakeholder issue is important. Southwest was geared toward that aspect of defining what customers wanted, not necessarily listening to what each individual customer wanted. Now, by the way, the thing I remembered what I was going to ask you, Susan, there's another piece here, which is that handoffs have a risk of misunderstanding. Oh, and this was the other one. Developers think they spend a lot of time fixing bugs. I've talked to thousands and thousands and thousands of developers. I mean, it's literally maybe tens of thousands. I used to do seminars, courses, so two, three a month for years. And most developers think they spend a lot of time fixing bugs. And almost nobody does unless they're doing automatic testing and behavioral driven development or something like that, where the system finds the bug instantly or lets them know there's a bug instantly. See, if you know the bug, if you know something's wrong as soon as you put it in, you know that it probably happened because you just put it in. But if it's a month's work and something goes wrong, you don't know what happened. It's something you've done over the last month. So they spend a lot of time finding the bug. So the speed is a big thing. Okay. Small increments are better. Rate of interactions better. Developers have a different perspective than customers. We need to recognize this. The rate at which you get clarity. I'm going through this a little fast because I wanted to show one other thing, and then we'll still have about on time. An hour and 15 minutes was fine. And then we have 15 minutes. The rate at which you get clarity and understanding what to do is dependent upon the way you work. This is huge. This is huge. This is what this whole thing was about, is this statement right here. Because if we just say we're going to just go get our requirements and understand and talk and we do it the same way, well, I'm sorry. That may or may not be applicable. Why? Because I've done, sorry, I went too far. I had 4 different ways of working here. Is this clear? That if I went and got the information the same way in these 4 different cases, I'm going to cause a lot of rework. This idea that we can take one way of working, oh my God, Alvin, now I got to think harder. Well, yes, but see, this is the power of a pattern, because the pattern will tell you which way to go. Now, I haven't written them up yet. I know, I got excited. Maybe I should have done this next week, but I really think that this is not a new way of work. I did this in the 80s. I did this in the 90s. What just hit me in yesterday's session was I've been doing this. I'm just formulating it now. And when you have the patterns, you can say, well, what's the situation I'm in? I'm in this. Oh, go do this. What's the situation I'm in? Do you notice I can still come from the problem solution, the problem space, the context, give you a potential way to solve the problem? And there's one last bit to all this I want. And this ties it together. How much of what you do is valuable and how much is waste? So I'm not in the debate if it's good for the customer, it's not waste. And if it isn't good for the customer, it is waste. These are some things we do. I think these are useful things. Now, maybe some of these things you don't need to do as much of others, but I think this is good stuff. I should say learning, not training there. I have to bring that up to date. But this is not a good thing. 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 I put fixing bugs because remember, it's not fixing, it's finding the bug that takes all the time. Duplicating components. I've been in the software business since 1970. That's when I first wrote my program when I got to university. I got into business applications around 79. No, but I was doing scientific research with multiple people in 77. Okay. I have seen a lot of integration take place, and in my entire career, and clients, I've been in hundreds of clients. I've only seen 2 integration errors. Only 2. That's amazing, isn't it? See, to me, what is an integration error? Well, let me ask you this. If I'm a tester and you write some code, or no, let's put it the other way. I'm a developer and you're a tester, and I write some code, and you test it, and you show what I wrote doesn't work. Is that a testing error? Is it? I don't think so. I think it's a development error.
A testing error would be not testing what what it should do. And
That's right.
testing
Something missed
helps.
or a false negative. Yeah, that'd be a testing error. Okay, so now let me ask you this. If I'm a developer and I've got a friend over here who's another developer, and we have made an agreement on how to work, and then we say, here, take this stuff of mine, and he says, take his stuff of his, and you're the integrator, and you put it together, and the two places don't talk to each other. Why do we call that an integration error? It seems like we made the agreement wrong.
Well, I think it's where you discover the error, just
That's
like
right.
the test. You
Yeah, but
discover
for some reason, when it's discovered in testing, they know to call it a developer error, but when they discover it in integration, they call it an integration error. Now, the integration error would be as if I give you the stuff and he gives you the stuff, and then you integrate it improperly. That's an integration error. I've almost never seen that happen. That's why that's in quotes. Anyway, you can go faster maybe in planning and testing, especially if you have some tools to use, but more or less you can't. So only when automated. Lean is not about going faster. Lean is about something else. This is when they say faster, better, cheaper. Anybody, when they say faster, better, cheaper, no. You're eliminating delays. Your focus is on eliminating delays, not going faster. These are all time bombs waiting to happen. That's what those little things are. Okay, one last thing, just because I thought this was useful. So Amplio is based on an integration of flow, lean theory of constraints, and the iron triangle was disproved 60 years ago. The idea that if you have scope, if you have scope, time, and cost fixed, quality will suffer, was disproved 60 years ago by Toyota. Now, unfortunately, at the time, people didn't recognize that, at least Americans didn't. We said, oh, they're dumping on us. In other words, they were selling cars of higher quality and at lower costs than we could make. So obviously they're failing us. They're doing something because we're the smartest people in the world. And if we can't figure out how to do it, then obviously they're cheating. Okay, that's kind of an American attitude. Don't want to get into politics, but that's been here for 50, 60, ever since I've been an adult. That's how Americans think sometimes. What they were doing was something else, and I didn't really appreciate it totally myself until I read the goal. I had some appreciation in the 80s because I was studying lean in the 80s, studying Toyota. It wasn't called lean. What was happening was if you build, there are two things. Theory of constraints says one thing and lean says another thing, but they're related. Theory of constraints and the goal, he talks about there's this incremental cost. So if you're running, in fact, I had this experience when I worked at IBM, is we ran some of the work we did at research. We ran the things at night, and yet we got charged full time for the use of the 360s we were using, the IBM mainframes. Well, it turns out the incremental cost, that was ridiculous. Why? Because the mainframes were already paid for. We were incrementally costing electricity because they were turned on and had to be maintained anyway. So if you don't recognize that capital costs can be spread out over you don't spread it out. It's the incremental cost of building something. But Toyota did something else as well. They found that if you attend to quality of the process and quality of the product, because attending to the quality of the product means you create less waste, you have more time to add value, or in manufacturing, you get more cars built in less time because you have less rework to do. So the elimination of waste by focusing on quality lowers the amount of time and effort to get stuff done. So when you focus on quality, you actually shrink the cost and you shrink the time. And this is something Tom Gilb and I wrote up in the Penta. We have our kind of own way of doing it, but it's inspired by the Toyota. So much of improving quality is achieved by removing delays and workflow. You focus on quality. Again, we're not looking at the right thing. And what we need to do here is see at our level of understanding, if all you're doing is inspect and adapt, which is what most people do, oh, this happens, so I do this. You're not building a model. And this is a great quote by Deming, which sums it up. Experience teaches nothing. In fact, there's no experience to record without theory. Without theory, there's no learning, and that is their downfall. People copy examples, and then they wonder what it is the trouble. They look at examples, and without theory, they learn nothing. This is a cornerstone of the Amplio system based on the foundations of it. PDSA and the Observe Orient Decide Act model are both based on this concept. Knevin tells us we can't see this. Inherent simplicity tells us we can. And that's a big piece. Okay, I'm done with what I'm going to show. Sorry, this was a bit more lecture oriented than I intended. But I don't know. I was so excited after yesterday's session. I felt I had to get this written down and done. And this will become the third session of the value-driven objectives. I'll be putting this in. The ACE learning journey slide. Anybody who liked this, I will be putting this on the meetup as a recording, but if you want to get references to everything, I invite you to join the Amplio community of practice, which is free and has a more organized way of all these different things I've talked about. Okay. So if you're already in the ACOP, this will get in there too, and then with better links and information. But anyway, we got another 8 minutes. Can you give me some feedback about? There was Abizi's comment. Let me get to that. Almost forgot. Okay. Actually, there are two questions here. How does Amplio attend to sustainability? Well, do you mean by sustainability like people, or do you mean the product? Or even both. It's actually good to ask it both ways, but I'm curious what your question was. It about sustainability of people work, or was it about sustainability of the product, or both?
I think it's both, yeah, sustainability from both perspective.
Okay.
Well, I actually think Amplio does, if you follow a lot of the things that you say about the approach, I just think that sustainability is inherently built, but I would like to hear from you concisely.
Yeah, no, you bring, like I say, you always ask these great questions. Because I should be talking not just about the principles. When I teach something, I should be talking about the sustainability. And I would suggest there are three sustainabilities. Just occurred to me, the third one. So let's go through them. The first one is sustainability of the product. And the second one is sustainability of the individuals. And the third one I would suggest is sustainability of the development community. Now, let me talk about that. But let me go first one. Sustainability of the product. Well, remember, you've got objectives. So the idea is you're always moving toward the objectives and creating clarity on the objectives. So as long as you've got clear where you're headed, it becomes easier to see how to enhance it. And now we have this iterative development of let's get the objectives, let's work toward it. Okay, we've met the objectives. Now what's the next level of objectives? This model of expanding objectives into new areas, then this gives us a model of enhancing products over time. And something I didn't cover, I said I was going to today, is the quickest valuable releases. These aren't really MVPs, because MVPs are when you're discovering a new product, but it's incremental building, incremental value. So I think the objectives implement leads to a good sequence of sustainability of the product. Now, as far as sustainability of individuals, if you could avoid doing a lot of rework, and if you could avoid causing the chaos of doing a lot of rework, and if you could avoid the pressure that your management gives you because you're doing all this rework that gets them, they're not happy with the work you're doing, you would be in a better working environment and sustainable.
Yeah.
In fact, bringing that up, let's talk about the company. Is the company a company that can continue to deliver good products on an ongoing basis? They're more sustainable. So I got four things now. Okay, now I'm going to give you the one I said was three, that's now four. What do I mean by the community? See, here's a problem I saw. In fact, I think this is going to play itself out again. In the 90s, early 2000s, I've talked about how I'm not very happy with the big consulting firms. I've never been happy with the big consulting firms. In fact, I joke, but it's not a joke, that the idea of outsourcing that the big consulting firms used in the 90s has now been replaced by AI. So now saying AI is going to do it all. They're so proud of AI, and I think disasters are getting ready to happen. I'm a big believer in AI, but you've got to use it the right way. I'm not going to talk about that right now. Maybe we'll make that another session. But the problem is, sorry, went off with the judgment on the consulting firms, and now I lost my model. Oh, community. Okay, I got it. So I remember going into companies, and I don't mind saying, I won't say the company, but I will say who they use. They use Bain and Company, and they were almost about to implode. And the reason they were going to implode was Bain had told them to outsource. So what happened is they started hiring. This is different from offshoring. Companies offshoring is fine, although that has its own problems as well. But outsourcing was the big thing back then. And offshoring has its own problems. But anyway, we did something we called nearshoring at Net Objectives. We used companies down in South America so the time zones were the same and we could keep, if we wanted to cut costs. I wasn't that big a fan, but if you were going to do it, we had a good way of doing it. Anyway, what happened is when they all outsourced, they also outsourced a lot of the product knowledge and the domain knowledge. And they let people go in the development. I said, well, we don't need developers knowing this because the product owners told them what to do and they know what it says. And the answer is no, the product owners had no idea because sometimes they would go, I mean, it sounds bizarre, but the product owners would ask, well, here's what we want. And then they figured they had written it in the code. So all the business roles were documented kind of in the code. They weren't documented in another manual elsewhere. People couldn't locate it. And when I showed up, this very large healthcare company that had outsourced all their work, they said there were 2 developers. I'm talking about amongst hundreds who understood how the software worked. Everybody else just knew this little piece, little piece, little piece. And the guy brought me in because he said, we really look like we're in trouble. So there was no community because it had been outsourced and they let people go. And a lot of them left too when they saw this happening. So when you talk about objectives, and you talk about requirements and implementations and solutions, notice we're creating an objective model. Why are they trying to do what they're doing? Why does the customer do this? Right now, the current agile model is actually almost the antithesis of what you should have. See, I believe developers need to have direct contact with customers. That's okay to have a product owner deciding what to do, but actually, I even dislike the role of the product owner. I can't think of. There's Mark Schwartz is the guy's name. I can't think of the book he wrote. He just vilified the current model of the product owner. She going to Amazon. Mark, pretty sure this was it. The Art of Business Value. I mean, this guy just lays out the problem with a product owner figuring out what customers want without attending to the stakeholders of the organization. I don't remember if he talks about Scrum or anything like that, but boy, it just whole vilifies the entire agile business discovery model. And part of that is because now you have developers not knowing how customers work so well. Now, I know Scrum doesn't say to do that, but that's what happens. Because if somebody's going to tell them what to do and they're not going to be listened to directly anyway, they got other things to do to get pressure off them. And that's what happens. This is called looking at what reality is instead of what your theory or hypothesis about how your approach would be. Okay, so anyway, got a little deep there. Got a minute for the other one. Any other questions pop up, let me know. But Dale, he's not here, but hopefully he'll listen to the recording. He had a good question. Dale Tom, he had some third-party events and actions, a system of forces example. Exactly. This is perfect. This is why I like to have these sessions, because I don't know it all for sure. And I only have certain levels of experience. That's why Amplio was a collection literally from 10,000 conversations I had over 20 years, different perspectives. But this one, we need to add in other developing groups that we have some control over and other developer groups we don't have any control over. That would need to be in here. In this case, it was an internal group, not third party, but I had no control over them due to political, not a political, but bureaucratic things within the organization. Okay. Any other questions? We're at about closing time. I do try to keep this to an hour and a half. Any comments from anybody? Kurt, I'm wondering how this is for you. Oh, good. You came off mute. What's up?
Well, this is my first session. It sounds like you've had a
Oh,
series of sessions, and you talked about Amplio, and I have a range of motives for attending today's session.
yeah. Tell me some of
And
them.
well, I'm not developing. I'm sort of retired actually,
That's fine.
but all my IBA, my stuff that I've learned has very broad application. And so the principles that you talked about today are related mostly to software, but the fact is those same principles apply to people.
That's right.
And I'm in volunteer situations where we're trying to impact people. And so these systems actually can work. I mean, the principles can work for people. So that's frankly my motivation. It's,
Good.
um,
I'm so glad you said this because there are two things, and I can give you some other places to be looking, and that's what I'm
well, that'd
pulling
be
out.
great. But so tell me about you said you've got some content that's available and
Yeah. Okay. So
recordings and all of that stuff. So
let me show
I feel
you.
like I missed about 10 meetings, but
No. This is only, I think, the third session in this. Let me tell you, give you a little history. This is
so
perfect that you said that because
but in terms of the IIBA folks, is this IIBA's Orange County first session or third
no.
session?
So let me give you a little history of this, and because I don't need it to be a hard and fast 9:30. I'm just, I try to, since you've
Yeah.
asked now, we'll take 10 minutes to talk about this, and this will be a good ending, a good overview of something. So what prompted this thing I call the Amplio Meetup Group is I've been seeing people wanting to redo the Agile Manifesto. In particular, the PMI did something, and I thought the approach they were taking was not so good. But then I decided, well, I'll help them anyway. And I was thinking, well, what we wanted to do in this group was start what I call the Amplio living ecosystem, meaning we're going to build principles to build on by teaching practices. And that was the initial session a few weeks ago. And we laid this out, and I have some lucid boards I'm not going to show, but that was the idea. And then we had another session where we realized, well, we wanted to come from the problems. And we also said, well, how do we get people the real problem? And you find this interesting. I'll put these URLs on the meetup page so you can go find this. One of the things I've seen in the agile space is that people think things aren't possible. And this is triggered by what you just said, what you're trying to do. I've got a good friend who also does volunteer work. And he's been software, but he's been a lot of non-software. And he's working with some family services kind of people and stuff. And they just don't think they can get certain stuff done and they're overwhelmed. So this book has gone through a couple iterations, but what it's designed to do now is why is it that people, and this has nothing to do with software. This first part is how do we get trapped in not in thinking we can't get stuff done or in having a limit when as an experienced person, you could get more done than that. But they think that's the limit. They think it's here and it's there, but how do you get them to go up? Okay. So this first part of the book has absolutely nothing to do with software. I might refer to Agile every now and then just to give an example. Like, here's an example. These create learned helplessness. They believe it's not possible, or they're in fear, or managers are telling them, hey, don't do that. It gets nervous when they try something, or change is taught in a way they don't get it. So this first part has nothing to do with software. And then what I'm doing is writing something about learned helplessness in the agile space. This is product development, software or not. But we haven't done it yet. But one of our aces, Case of La France, is looking in this should in this one, restoring learning capacity. He's written about this. How do you get people to break out of it? Okay. So Amplio uses software and product development a lot because that's where I grew up in. But all these ideas apply elsewhere because they're all based on lean, theory, constraints, and flow, which are not limited to software. Okay. So this is one thing. Now, the other thing is how to teach. So one of the things in the Amplio system is it really, I won't say it doesn't do you any good to know something. It does. But it does you a lot more good if you know how to teach it and coach other people in it. So Amplio integrated is integrated with not just how do you discover, or not just integrated with how you work, but integrated to how do you coach and how do you teach. Okay. And so part and parcel, this book is I finally figured out how I can use AI, ChatGPT. This book is written, but it's just not focused, and I spent a couple hours. So this book is going to be ready for publication pretty soon because we've got a plan now to turn this into, and it's more about learning and coaching. Okay, you know well, anyway, I won't go into that, but that's another resource. I'll put these up on the meetup. Okay, now finally, what I was suggesting you do is if you go, we call this the Learning Center. Now, in the Learning Center, there are lots of options. This is what I show you, but I'm not trying to sell you on something. Sell meaning you'd have to pay money. Okay, we do have money tracks. Okay, this gets you much access, all sorts of good stuff, but the other thing, and this is what I meant, the free Amplio community practice. Okay. You can also get here by just taking Learning Center and taking that. Now, the community of practice I'm in the process of laying this out, but I've got a lot of good stuff here. And I'll give you a link. Are you in the ACOP now? The community, or you just came in through the meetup?
I came in through the meetup. I mean, actually, the whole sign up was really a pain. That's why I was late. I was
Yeah,
looking
we were
for
talking
Zoom
about
links.
that. I'm going to fix that. I thought Meetup would be okay, but it's okay for me because I'm the owner of it. I'm going to make that simpler. Everybody was complaining. You're not alone.
Well, I mean, I'm
Even
not really complaining. It's just an
I
insight
know
about the
it's
flow, and I'm
yeah.
glad to be here. It was a
I
great,
call
good
that
meeting.
negative feedback, and thank you. Negative feedback is often the best kind of feedback. I didn't get it. You were mad at me or anything. Okay, so what in the ACOP, what we have is we've got it organized around these topics. Now, there are not a lot of topics yet because the free part hadn't been built out. But so the way you join the ACOP is you come in here. I'll put this in the chat. And I wonder, I tell you, well, anyway, the ACOP. Well, anyway, if you come in here, this is free, okay? And then you'll get notes from me a week, and it'll be a lot easier. And I'm going to have one link. And um, so these are the things. So I put this in the chat, but I'll put these URLs. In fact, I'll just go ahead and put them. No, I'll do this right away. So you can go back to the meetup in like 30 minutes, and I'll have links to this book and this book. Okay, they're up on Google Docs. You can come in as a commentator. Um, but go ahead and register here. If you just go in here, see, I'm registered, so I got in, but otherwise it'll just ask you to register. See, if you come in here and
Well,
you
I think
see,
I have an account. I'm not exactly clear what happened. I was in a hurry to try to.
yeah, well, you may be there, but go into this, and if you want to do more, um, the ACOP is free. That's this one. It'll say free. I'm enrolled, so it says enrolled. And if you actually want to go more involved in all this, it's $49 a month. They all give you full access to everything. The difference is this enables you to use the materials license free everywhere. This enables you to use it only at the place you're working. And although I make exceptions at times. And then this is a partner program, which you're not interested in for sure. And you're probably not interested in this, just interested in that. What kind of companies are you working with?
Nonprofits. I
Yeah.
have a congregation I'm involved with, so
Yeah. Okay.
some things with that.
and there are times I make exceptions based on people who are just doing good to society. So anyway, but this is what I do as the next step. And now I'm not sure what I'm doing next week in the meetup, but let me get a little feedback from y'all. I'm actually I went to the meetup group, and I think the meetup group might still make sense, but I think well, let me ask you this, Kurt.
Uh-huh.
If I had said, here's the meetup group, and it explained things, what the purpose of the meetup group is, but it said to attend the sessions, you had to go to the ACOP, and then it gave you an easy way to get in, gave you a step-by-step way to register and all that, would that have been a bar to you? Seems like not, because it'd be simpler than what you had to go through.
Maybe not. I mean, I was looking. We've been doing this same process for decades.
Yeah.
You register, and you get an automated link from Sue that says, "Here's the registration link. Click Zoom, and you're in."
Yeah. And the meetup
So
doesn't do that. I'm
it doesn't
actually
do that. So
thinking,
I had to dig around, and I finally sort of re-registered. Sort of. I had a username and password at that point.
yeah,
And then I saw, oh, okay, here's a link that says join the groups, and I had tried in the emails to join through Google Meet. Well, there wasn't anybody on Google Meet, and I tried that a couple times. I think, wonder if
yeah.
I got the wrong link. So
Well,
was the process.
well, let me ask Susan and Tony, because we had talked about this before in Abizi as well. It seems that what I should do is keep the meetup, but have the meetup tell you to join the ACOP, and then in the ACOP, it'll give you this is about to happen.
Could be.
It,
I don't know.
it might be a good thing. And just one side note to Kurt, the reason these are showing up in IIBA Orange County is that we're trying to partner with other organizations, including this one, to have things available to VAs that may be useful to them, even if it isn't an official IIBA thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a great thing. I've always appreciated that about you and the group in general. So
Okay.
you're
Yeah,
always looking for new opportunities.
I think that might be, and then what I do, I just have to get a little discipline. I do weekly emails, and one of the things I can do in the weekly ACOP email is send a reminder to people with the Zoom. And then that'll bring, I have that little manual piece of work, but I do that anyway. So this is nothing. Okay, good. So I'll do that. Okay, so any other things, or are we good? Did I answer all the questions you had, Kurt? I think I did, but I'm not certain.
Yeah. I mean, my brain doesn't work real fast at this time of the day. So yeah, I think I got the questions. I've
Okay,
taken a
good.
couple of screenshots, and hopefully
Anything
we're good.
else? Any other questions? BZ, did you have any, or anybody else have other questions?
Nothing for me at this time.
Okay, well, I'll get this up on the site. And Susan, Tony?
Yes, great.
Okay, all good. Well, I'm going to close this off. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate
Okay,
the help on this.
great. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah.
Bye.